Man. Yeah, so I was watching your street debates. So
Mm, mm.
so for one thing, I think you need to fix your technical issues. Whatever microphone you're using, it's only picking up on one channel. It's pretty easy.
Yeah, that
Like,
was one video. One video I accidentally, when I exported, I was like, fuck, and I already uploaded it, and I was like, ah, whatever. We'll just go with it for this one. But
okay,
yeah, the rest I always make sure I got the two channels going.
okay. So the fundamental issue that I've seen in most of your debates, I see two issues. One thing is that I think you overly focus on the welfare argument. And
Mm.
two, like there's instances where I see you actually arguing against animal rights, and it kind of puts you in a funny position, like when people bring up like lions, tigers, predatory animals, or like needing to like kill to survive. Um,
Mm.
I think people don't really know how to articulate why it's a problem for you to have those positions, but like they just have an intuitive understanding, and it makes it harder to take you seriously. So, Jesus Christ, somebody just
Reacts to
donated a
Johnny
spam.
Shreve's I got confronted video. It's similar to
Yeah,
what you
right.
would
Do you
see
have
there.
some examples of like where I've done that? Because it would be good to refer to it.
Yeah, okay, so I think that happened in your debate with the crazy fucking Christian guy.
Profit
Um
Man.
yeah, at the horse racetrack or whatever.
Yeah, yeah.
I know you weren't talking about like meat eating necessarily there, and it was like about the horses and shit. So it is a bit more of a welfarist kind of situation, but generally speaking, and I see Joey kind of do this thing too, and I think it's a bit of a mistake. If you're going to rely on welfarist arguments, you're not really arguing for their rights fundamentally, because like again, I think anyone would agree it's like wrong to torture animals, it's wrong to kick them, and do the shit we're doing. But
Yeah. But it's
you're
irrelevant, right?
yeah, like it like the meat of the issue is that you're able to do any of this: confine them, breed
Mm.
them, like abuse them, kill them. So the meat of the issue is just that they don't have the same rights as human beings. And I think you just really need to like argue veganism from that standpoint, that they should have the same rights and protections as humans. I would
Yeah, that
define.
is my argument. I would say that animals have the same right to live a life from unnecessary harm just as we do.
Well, I wouldn't use that term unnecessary. Like, what do you mean by unnecessary?
Well, we can't avoid all harm, can we? Like, that's a part of life in some degree, but if it's unnecessary and avoidable, sorry, well, then I believe that we all deserve the right to avoid that.
What I would say is a better way to look at it is you should not commit rights violations. There, you
Hmm.
can commit harm, so to speak, without violating rights. A good example I'd say of that would be like having a cornfield. You may spray pesticides in that cornfield. You may like displace some amount of wildlife. And you'll hear this from, like anti-vegans, like, oh, what about all the insects? What about all the little field animals? Well, even though you may be killing insects, even though, like, to some extent you may be harming some of the field animals, like, some of them are going to get kicked up by a combine, I wouldn't consider that a rights violation for a few reasons. One, it is your property. And if these animals or insects are, say, destroying your property, I think you do have, to some extent, a right to defend your property. Like if we just let like locust just completely devour all of our food, okay, well, we'll starve to death, and they're destroying your property. So if the only like logical way or reasonable way to stop them would be to use pesticides, I don't see that as a rights violation. And again, you could look at this as a logical extension of human rights. If there were humans in the field eating the crops, or like doing whatever the fuck in a field, like mentally stupid humans or something, and the only reasonable way to deal with them would be to use like pesticides or something that kills them, I think most people would agree, like, okay, like if that's the only thing you could reasonably do, So that's an example of causing harm, but it's not necessarily violating rights. And there's another layer to that, like insects are largely carnivorous. They don't live very long, and even field animals, there's actually no evidence that farming increases the amount of deaths within that unit of land. So you should look you should always look at veganism as a logical extension of human rights. When you start using terms like when it's necessary, well, people are like automatically going to go to, oh, so like if I absolutely need to for food, or if I have to hunt or like kill to survive. Well, that's not ethical necessarily. If like let's say
Yeah, I guess that's I would agree with you in saying that even if it came to necessity, it doesn't make it an ethical thing. I agree with you there.
yeah, and you should be clear. I've seen you make this mistake a bit. I've seen Joey and especially Earthling Ed make this mistake a ton. They will excuse killing animals when somebody needs to survive. Like say they're stranded on a desert island or some other hypothetical. That doesn't make it ethical. It may be understandable.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah, but it doesn't make it ethical, and you should make sure whenever somebody brings up that point that it's not ethical to kill to survive. Like if there were like say aliens, like from the movie Alien, xenomorphs, would it be okay for them to kill us? Well, they need to survive, right? Or vampires, like is it okay for vampires to kill us? Well, they need to survive. So you should always just look at things from a rights perspective. So that's one thing. And again, just like really harping on the welfarist arguments. Anybody can like say, okay, well, that doesn't happen at my farm, or I don't think the industry is that bad.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I'm not. I
Yeah.
don't take a welfare point of view. I
Yeah.
completely will avoid the. I do like to start off with, "Are you against animal abuse?" Because I think abuse could be extended to just taking someone's life in general is a form of abuse. Like you said, it is a violation of their rights. It abuses their rights. So if they say they're against animal abuse, I'd like to start it there, and that's always something good to come back to when they say, "Oh, but I enjoy the taste," or whatever, but you already said you're against it, so that's making you a hypocrite. That would be my stance, so I agree with you there.
Yeah, and a lot of your debates, they're kind of unfocused. And like, again, if you're going to argue from a rights perspective, I think you should usually just open up with name the trait. Name the trait is just such a good tool for focusing the debate, because in some of your debates, it'll go to like welfare, some of the evidence of like cruelty, and then you'll talk about whether or not it's okay to kill in certain circumstances, and then you'll start talking about the environment.
What are you
Sorry?
referring to there? And which example?
Yeah, so in a lot of your debates, I've seen that happen. Some are worse than
Because I'll
others.
only talk about that if they ask, "Oh, what's wrong with dairy?" Well, then I'll say what goes on in industry practices. But then I say, "Look, but that's irrelevant, isn't it?" Even if they were treated fairly and they had a pain-free death, if that in that hypothetical example, I would still argue and get them to understand. But that is irrelevant to the animal. That is always my position. So I don't know where that's coming from.
Okay, but I haven't seen you run the name the trait reductio.
I say,
And
what's the moral difference?
I think you should make it clear that they have to demonstrate some sort of substantive, like material difference between humans and animals. And by material, I mean like they have to point out some specific trait or set of traits. It just makes it a lot easier to communicate like what you want from them, and it forces them to actually give you an answer. Because if you say, what's the moral difference? Oh, well, we're human beings, we have like a society and we need to live. Like, it's not something specific enough. So I think you should
I
run.
think I think the position I would normally take is I always try to get them to empathize and understand how does that make a difference for the animal. Yes, you can create more pain-free ways, whatever they go down, whatever route they go down to say to make them feel good about murdering an animal, essentially. I will then say, I always just bring it back. But how do you think the animal feels, or how do you think they would feel about having their life taken away from them when it's completely avoidable? So I always try to bring it back to an empathetic point of view. I don't. Yeah.
Again, so two things with that. It doesn't force them to actually identify whether or not there's a meaningful difference between humans and animals that would justify their action. Two, these people lack empathy for animals, so I think it is useful in a lot of cases to argue from a more logical perspective than an emotional
I
one.
agree.
I've
I agree. So
seen,
what
I saw the debate
is
you had with those school kids, and like, there's times to use those sorts of emotional arguments on people who are sympathetic. Like, how would the animal feel if you know that? Oh, like, they
I
say
know what I
something
do
like, "Oh, I
say.
feel really bad when I eat meat." So
Yeah.
yeah,
See, this is I think a better question would be, how would you feel if you were in the animal's position? That's what I tend to ask.
again, it's easy for somebody to not rationalize that and say, well, I'm not an animal, or like, I don't know, I'd be a pig, so I'd be retarded and I wouldn't be able to think. Like, if you force them to run a name the trait reductio, they actually have to think why animals should not have those rights.
Yeah.
And it's like when you point out to them that, like, if they say, "Oh, well, they're not as intelligent as us," I think a lot of people would, think that's like an easy kind of answer. Well, then you run the reductio. Okay, so you're fine with killing mentally disabled people, and then they realize, "Oh, wow, like that reasoning is terrible." And then they start
Mm.
thinking about the ethical issue. Like, again, a lot of people do lack empathy towards animals, but they do have empathy for humans. So name the trait kind of forces them to look at animal rights as a logical extension of human rights. So when they're harming animals, they're kind of harming people. There's no way to really
Exactly.
justify, animal agriculture
Yeah.
without taking away human rights.
Yeah, I agree. And look, I think that this is all worthwhile considering. But I do agree with you on most of these things anyway. But since working when I went over east and we did some work with Paul Bashir, and since utilizing that method that he currently teaches, out of probably I don't know how many conversations I've had since then, maybe I don't know, 20, 30. I would say it's almost like a 70% success rate. They all end up saying, yep, I'm going to go vegan. And then they might say, oh, at some point in the future. And you say, okay, but if you're in the animal's position, would you want your oppressor to stop in the future? Would you want them to stop now? And they say, yes, actually, you're right. I would prefer them to stop now. So I ask them, what are you going to do? And they say, well, I'll probably go vegan, or I will go vegan. And then I give them some resources. That's probably been, I mean, I haven't counted, but it, that's within probably a 10 to 20-minute outreach. And that's probably been 70% of them. The
Okay,
other 30% are just people that are unreachable, if you know what I mean.
sure. Yeah, if that method works and you're running into a lot of sympathetic people who can put themselves in the animal's shoes, then sure, use that approach. But that guy you debated, the self-proclaimed prophet teaches veganism a lesson, the second last video you uploaded, that guy was insanely thick-headed.
It was.
In those situations, I think you really do just need to embarrass those people to some extent. Like,
And
they'll know
that's the
when
job.
they're like,
Yeah.
they'll know when they're losing an argument. I saw that debate, and kind of over and over again, you were pushing him on like, how would the animal feel, and he just wasn't getting it. He just wasn't debating you on that level. And I actually have some other things to talk about when you're debating religious people. Um,
Sure.
but I think that's when you absolutely have to deploy name the trait, when people just aren't kind of meeting you on that emotional level. So, yeah, the only thing there, I'd say, if if that method you're using of asking people to put themselves in animal shoes, if that's working for you, then yeah, use that. If you run into
Yeah.
super thick-headed people, then you should just, deploy name the trait reductios.
Yeah. Yeah, and I do try. I haven't used it in those words. I'll give that a go. It'll be interesting to see how that works with people with the actual name, the literal trait difference that allows you to murder them,
And it
but
can
not
be
humans.
multiple traits. So it doesn't have to be one trait. You can point that out to them. And sometimes people have issues with running reductios. Like, somebody might name a kind of weird trait, like language or something, or just something kind of, and then you have trouble kind of, okay, what would the reductio be? You can, like, obviously just doing these debates would be practice for that, and then you can kind of review and ask people like what you should have done. Ask Yourself's Discord would probably be able to help you a lot with that if you're not used to deploying name the trait. But yeah, just try using that next time you do activism, see how it goes.
Yeah.
The other thing, when you're dealing with religious people, it's best to avoid using the theological argumentation and reasoning they use. Like, the guy was talking about the Bible, and then you'd like mention, oh, but what about Jesus? He doesn't like kill animals. He was a shepherd, and crap like that.
I didn't do that, no.
Well, I know what you mean, but you were kind of...
I literally never go into the Bible. I just say I don't really care about what your
yeah.
Bible says. That mentality, yeah.
Yeah, but what you want to do is make them use secular arguments, and again, name the trait is a good way to do that. So if somebody says, "Oh well, God gave us this right, to have dominion over animals," so that could technically be the trait. So say the reductio would be, okay, say if God did not give us these, or give a certain type of people these protections, say black people were not considered by God to be his chosen people, and you had dominion over black people just as you had animals, would it be okay to treat black people the same as we treat animals? That easily and clearly points out that even if somebody does believe this, like their religious beliefs lead them to that, it's probably not a good idea to create policies where just merely on faith alone and just belief alone you can take away rights. So it kind of forces people to use secular argumentation in order to justify what they're doing. But again, even if they refuse to use secular argumentation, how stupid do they look saying, on faith alone, I could say it's okay to like Holocaust people. So
yeah.
Name the trait is a good way around.
I guess
things.
I want to use those words, name the trait. I'll give it a go, see how it, but I normally will just use the word. I'll probably say it like this. I'll say, what is the moral difference that allows you to abuse, exploit, and murder animals, but not humans? That's what I'll tend to ask. And I think it has the same effect, because I'll say, oh, well, because animals are less valuable than humans. And then I'll go into that, right? So I think, I mean, what would be the difference between asking that and what you're saying?
The difference is, if they're going to say animals are less valuable, your response is going to have to, in response to that, you're going to have to try to explain to them why they're not less valuable. Whereas no, you kind of are. Whereas if you run name the trait, well, if they say, okay, well, it's okay to kill animals because they're less valuable, you are to some extent going to have to like convince them that there isn't a significant difference in value.
I would say it's just what I normally do, and I'll tell you what I normally would say if someone says that, because it was just the other day he said that animals are lower than humans. It was particularly religious people. I just uploaded another religious man one. It's quite interesting, so check it out.
I'll check that one out.
I don't know if it was in the video I just uploaded, but he pretty much just said, they're lower value. And I guess I can't remember exactly what I said, but how I would typically frame it is, so based on your value system, what you see and what you value and how you value animals, does that still give you the right to abuse and murder them? Just because you might value certain humans less than others, or certain humans might be less valuable. But I guess it's more just, it's irrelevant. It's irrelevant, your value system, to the animal. Does the animal care how you value it? Like, that's kind of the line I'll go down.
The easy response to that would be, well, I would just basically repeat myself. Well, that's just not the way it is. I don't see animals as valuable as people, and like you're just gonna basically gonna have to go to a name the trait reductio anyway. It just lets you have a more succinct conversation. So if you,
I guess just before you move on, I will just say that if it doesn't matter whether I don't care because I think humans are more valuable than animals and you can't convince me, well, then I would probably still ask something like, well, what if another human saw you as less valuable compared to their family members, which a lot of people do? People will say, you're less valuable than my mother, therefore, do I get to kill you? And they'll say, well, no, of course not.
Sure, but I'll explain why the conversation heads in slightly different directions, and I think the name the trait reductio makes things a little more succinct and a lot more impactful. So if
Sure.
you ask somebody what's the moral difference between humans and animals that justifies killing animals, and they say, well, we're just more morally valuable. Okay, we go down that road of you explaining, okay, so if I thought like your family member was less morally valuable, does that make it okay to kill them? That's how that goes down on that road. If you run name the trait, okay, name the trait or set of traits that justifies killing animals, but in order to be logically consistent, if we found humans lacking that trait, we would have to kill those animals. So now they have to think about how animal rights would actually impact human rights. They're getting that there's a logical extension from human rights. So they're already like not even implicitly, explicitly understanding that in order to justify taking away animal rights, you have to take away human rights. And if you're forcing them to name specific traits. Like in the situation you presented, they just say, "Oh, well, they're less morally valuable." And I mean, there's no like they may be like in their own heads they're right. There's no way to prove them wrong. It's like whether or not something's more morally valuable, that's completely subjective, but you're challenging them on their own worldview with name the trait. So if they think, okay, intelligence is the trait, like they're not nearly as intelligent, I only value things of a higher intelligence. Okay,
Yeah.
well, now mentally disabled people are up to become burgers. A
Yeah,
huge
yeah, yeah.
section of the population, and they're talking
I
about
know.
fundamentally taking away human rights,
Yeah.
creating a huge holocaust, and it's not just their families. It's I think it just is a bit more impactful. So
Yeah, I've been through
I
that many times before.
I would say just try running the named trait, see how it goes, especially with thick-headed people that like aren't kind of on your level and sympathizing.
Sure, sure. Yeah, no, no,
Yeah.
no. No, I get you. I get you. I think maybe just wording, maybe see how that plays out. If it's any different at all, it may be, it may not be, but we'll see.
And one last thing, just avoid using terms like necessary, because it's really vague. It muddies the waters, and it doesn't have anything to do with rights. Like we don't base rights on whether or not it's necessary to like maintain like your life or a certain level of living standards. Like okay, eating meat may be necessary for me to be happy. Good. Like maybe some people really fucking like eating meat. Like necessary can mean anything. I would just focus on violating rights. I'd just
Okay, and
totally avoid that word use.
what if someone says, I don't really care about animals' rights. I'm going to eat them anyway. What would you say?
Well, again, animal rights are a logical extension of human rights. So, in any way to be consistent with that view, you would have to, by extension, take away human rights, which is something they're probably not going to be comfortable with. And if they say,
Well,
well, I don't need to be consistent, I don't know, like at that point, are they really even worth debating if they're going to like completely throw out logical consistency?
we'll see that. I think, see, like, so let's say someone does, like, say I'm a hypothetical person and I say, look, I don't care about animals' rights. I don't believe they actually exist. So I'm going to continue to eat them. What would you tell me as a person?
That they don't care about their rights and they're just going to continue to eat them?
Yeah, what would your argument be to that simply?
Yeah, my argument would be that, again, animal rights are a logical extension of human rights, and the only way for them to justify eating animals is if they identify some sort of trait or set of traits that animals are lacking that would take away their right to life. But if we found comparable human beings that are lacking those same traits, you would have to, by logical extension, agree that we should take away those human rights. So I would just force them to name the trait. I think anybody can do that, and I think like if somebody can't understand what you're asking of them there, they're just too stupid to even argue
So you
with,
just
and
end
they're a
the
waste of
conversation.
time. Like I've ran into people who you know, it just goes over their heads. They're too stupid. I'd say just they're a waste of time to even argue with. But
Yeah.
and then like they're forced to confront the reality that again, their moral outlook would justify literal holocausts of human beings. So they may not care about animals, but again, they may care about people. And if they recognize that their moral views would put people in jeopardy, that might actually get them to understand. Like, there are ways to avoid name the trait reductios in that circumstance. Like, yeah, you could say, okay, well, if I didn't care about you, like, does that make it okay for me to kill you? That is a legitimate way to argue.
Yeah, exactly.
But again, I think the name the trait is a little more impactful because like you're talking about literal holocaust rather than, you know, marginal cases of there's some psychopath who just doesn't care and starts killing people.
Interesting. Yeah. And when you were talking about necessity, how we shouldn't talk about necessity, but what if they bring it up? What if they say,
Yeah.
look, I think it's essential. I think it's essential for me to eat animals in order to survive, which I'm sure you've heard many times.
Sure. If you think that the reason they have some sort of ethical block is because they are lacking descriptive knowledge, like they think we need to for health. And I mean, again, if you're talking about like legitimate survival situations where people think they will die if they don't eat meat or something, or the world will collapse, people do have an interest in their own survival and their own species survival, which may override some other ethical issues they might have with eating meat. So I would either, like, depending on the situation, again, address those empirical points, like, okay, well, you can get B12 just fine. You can get all the vitamins you need. We can live on a completely plant-based food system. I'd go over that. And if they're still, like, if they're still going to make some, like, weird survival claim, like, it would have to be a marginal claim. Like, okay, what if I'm stranded on a desert island? Well, that marginal claim would only apply to that marginal claim, for one thing. And two, it still doesn't justify it. Like, again, if if you were stranded with another human, is it okay to kill and eat that other human to survive?
What do you think?
In most cases, no. In fact, maybe in any case, no. If you're going to have a kind of depends on your view. There's different ways to look at it. If you're going to look at it from a utilitarian point of view, if the situation is both of you are going to die, or if one of you dies and eats the other, then one can live. From a utilitarian perspective, then that would be the more ethical option for one to kill the other, so the one can live. If you're a deontologist, you would likely say, no, that would be a rights violation. So even if it would help one survive longer or survive the ordeal, that would still be a rights violation. From a threshold deontological position, it could go either way. But like again, if we're talking about like these weird survival instances, that doesn't really apply to like daily life. So you can get in the weeds there, but
yeah, I would say that it is still important to bring, because a lot of people do, like we know, a lot of people believe that it's necessary. Like we need it to survive. We are in a survival situation because we need flesh to survive. So that in that situation, like you did, you would say like, look, you can get all the nutrients, you can get B12. So essentially it is unnecessary. You're trying to prove that it's unnecessary, essentially from what you just said before. So I think still it is a matter of bringing up whether it is a necessity or not, because that allows you to then say, look, you can survive without it, therefore we should consider the rights of animals, and maybe not the other way around. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, when I say you should leave out words like necessary, I mean when you're making argumentation, you should never use phrases like it's wrong to eat meat unless it's necessary, or when it's necessary, or like why would you eat meat if it's not necessary? I would completely avoid that argumentation because it just gives people like an excuse to say, well, for one thing, necessary is a really weird, vague term. Could mean anything, like necessary for well-being, necessary to live for how long? 3 days, years. So that's one problem with it. And then again, when you're including words like necessary, it's besides the point of rights, right? So I would just argue from a rights perspective, I would just say terms like, if you're eating meat, you're violating rights. Why would you violate the rights of another creature by eating meat? I wouldn't say, why would you eat meat if it's not necessary when you don't need to commit this harm? It's just a vague term, and like, again, it doesn't really argue for the rights of the animal.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that I still think in some circumstances it might be important because, like you said, let's say you're in that hypothetical situation with another human. And like you said, you evaluated it up, you took the utilitarian perspective that, look, it would, if one of the humans does not eat the other human, they will both die. But if one does eat the other one, well, then at least one will survive and make it out in that hypothetical situation. You're in that situation, it's almost like rights go out the window when survival is the mainstay, when that is the thing that's at the forefront. So for most people in society, they believe that eating flesh, eating animals is an essential. Therefore, their rights is irrelevant. So I think it's important
Well,
to clarify if they have the question that it's not necessary and therefore we should consider, well, you said you're against animal abuse, so why do you continue to pay for it, kind of thing.
well, sure. If they're making an empirical claim and they're trying to make a justification based on that empirical claim, then yeah, you can certainly, use empirical evidence to debunk them that we don't need to eat meat. Also, with the island scenario, you're not like, it's not kind of apples to apples comparison, because supposedly if you're in an island scenario, you'd have to like kill and eat many animals in order to survive for a duration of time. So
Yeah,
like the more comparable scenario would be if you're strapped like trapped on an island with 10 people, and say a few of you might be able to survive, 3 or 4, but you have to like kill so many other people. Is that ethical? Like, how many people is it okay to kill just for your own survival?
yeah,
It's
exactly.
so you can point out that, but yeah,
Yeah.
that was most of what I just wanted to tell you about name the trait, and just really avoiding using terms like don't eat meat when it's not necessary, because anybody can claim it's a necessity, like based on what,
Yeah.
Yeah, just hammer the rights point. Don't say it's not necessary right now, because anybody can make a justification for it being necessary.
Mm, mm, mm. Yeah, no, I get what you're saying. But yeah, no, really useful to hear your perspective, and I will
Yeah, sure.
definitely consider that going forward, and I'll just see how it plays out in conversations. If there's a situation where it comes up, I'll give it a go, and we'll see how it turns out.
All right, sure. Good luck, dude. Liking the activism you and Tash is doing, so good job.
Yeah. Thank you very much, mate. All right,
All
you have a
right,
good
take
night
care, dude.
or
You
morning.
too. There we are.